Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. If you could please begin to take your seats, we are going to try to follow the only rule of the conference, which is to be on time. That includes starting on time. Okay, thank you so much. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Angela McKay. I am Director of Cybersecurity and Cloud Security Policy and Strategy at Microsoft, and it's my honor to be moderating this panel today. You are in the second session of the Cybercrime track, and it is about industry efforts to tackle cyber threats. For those of you who are not able to attend the first session of this particular track because you were enjoying one of the other ones, the first session included numerous government officials, and many of the issues that they talked about were kind of international frameworks for addressing cybercrime, some of the blending of cybercrime and international security issues, legal obstacles, and information sharing and networking. I'd like to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to provide a few opening remarks, and then we'll move into the discussion itself. So to my immediate left, we have Jerry Hoff. Jerry is very recently the president of Global Information Security and Privacy at Sony. Vice president. To my immediate right is Christoph Nicholas, is Senior Vice President and Head of Cyber Services and Technologies at Kudleski Security, Kudleski Group. Hope I pronounced that properly. And then second over to my right is Carlos Moreira. Carlos is Chairman and Chief Executive Officer and founder at WiseKey SA. So, just to kind of get us started, I thought I'd provide just a few introductory remarks. First of all, and this is an interactive portion of our session, is how many of you think you haven't been affected by cybercrime? Anyone? Anyone in the audience? Okay, then we have a very mature audience here with us today. I would actually just maybe share a little bit from my story. Outside of the work context, some of the things that have first brought cybercrime into my world actually involved when my dad called me. I was on my way to go to India. I was working at Microsoft, and he said, "Angela, my computer is doing really strange things." And I said, "Dad, what was the last thing you were doing on your computer?" And he said, "I was downloading free music." And that was the point where I said, "You know, Dad, you were the one who taught me that nothing in life came for free." That also applies to the internet. And that was in around 2009. So I live in the United States, and just in the last 12 months, I have personally received 4 notices from companies that my data has been subject to a breach in their environment. And there's actually at least 2 more who I should be receiving letters from. And so that really brings us into affecting each of us as individuals. What's going on in the cybercrime landscape is affecting us all, whether it's getting notifications about breach of data, identity theft, the cost that each one of us is incurring as part of the kind of linearization of fraud across the banking industry, or how we're all subject to spam from botnets in our email accounts. It's affecting us all as individuals. I am not going to repeat some of the numbers around the overall scale and scope of cybercrime globally. I think we've heard a lot of those, but I think I will repeat one that I think is pretty interesting. While the timeline is a little debated, the overall cybercrime economy exceeds the drug marketplace, illicit drug marketplace, by orders of magnitude. And that started to occur in the 2009 to 2012 timeframe. Lots of very valid sources from that, everything from Symantec to RAND have talked about those changes. But what does that mean for us in industry? And what does that mean for our customers? For industry, we are the creators, users, protectors, defenders, and responders to a wide range of cyber attacks, including those from cyber criminals. And we are responsible not only for protecting our infrastructure and data, but also looking after the interest of users, our internal users and our customers. I think what we hear a lot about in general reporting are some of the things like intellectual property theft and how that is affecting industry, and the efforts that we have to take to continually prevent, detect, and remove malware. In the previous session, they even started talking a little bit about ransomware and how that is increasingly occurring around the world. But that is just one example of the malware that industry has to protect itself, its users, and customers against. And at the same time, we also have to take efforts to protect vulnerable populations. I happen to mention my dad and his infamiliarity with the neighborhoods that are safe and unsafe in cyberspace. But whether it's the young, elderly, or some of the accessibility challenges that occur in cyberspace, we have protections that we have to provide for those communities. We also incur a lot of almost indirect cost from the cybercrime landscape. When you think about it, as we have to do more for cybersecurity, whether it's cost for due diligence, cost for compliance, cost when there's a private right of action and we can pursue legal remedies, whether it's for pirated software or copyright infringement. And we also have the kind of costs that we're incurring to do training and capacity building for our employees and governments. So one of the big, and I think probably one of the only upsides of all of the major breaches that we have heard about on a global basis, whether it was the attacks on Sony, that was before your time, the attacks on the European Central Bank, what we've seen with the Office of Personnel Management in the United States, or even the pension management system here in Japan. One of the upsides of that has driven an increasing focus and attention on cyber attacks and cybercrime at the board level. But what I often hear as I engage with boards and C-suites is they don't necessarily understand cyber risk. They don't understand the difference between a cyber criminal that's maybe a one-off versus the organized cyber crime world that we really see today versus what is just an unsophisticated attack potentially from a nation state versus an actual very advanced and persistent threat potentially by nation states. And they're really struggling with kind of, what are my responsibilities in this space? What should I expect from myself? How should I help my customers? And what should I expect the role of government to be in starting to counter these risks? So the good news is that industry is already doing a lot. We're doing things in the technical space, the operational space, and helping to influence public policy to counter cybercrime. Some of the technical changes include improvements in the assurance of software, so thinking about reducing the number and severity of vulnerabilities, whether it's in products or in cloud services, and improving the overall resiliency of those services. Things like new features, the advances that are being made in identity management and authentication, and even now what we're hearing more and more from my customer base is they're looking for services around the architectural shifts they need to take in their infrastructure and the overall strategy for that space. There are a lot of technical improvements. We're also doing a lot in the operational space, whether it's the things around enterprise risk management that I talked about earlier, the sharing of technical threat information, not just between industry and government, but also, and this is something I hope the panel will bring out, the kind of sharing of information that occurs among industry and the kind of outcomes that we can drive through information sharing. One of the things that does concern me when I hear the conversations on information sharing right now is that they're focused on information sharing as the actual outcome as opposed to the mechanisms we use to achieve real security outcomes together. So I hope we get into talking about that. One of the other things that I see that's been oftentimes merged together is information sharing versus incident reporting. These are two different models for the exchange of information, and they are not the same. And there are security challenges and benefits to each one of them, and I hope we explore that more. Industry is also doing a lot in the context of disrupting malware and doing botnet takedowns. Again, in the last session, someone referenced the collaboration that occurred to take down SIMDA botnet, but there's been a lot of work in this space. Maybe just two other points here in the operational collaboration, because I haven't heard them highlighted, is the industry community does a lot to collaborate with the security researchers. What is the right way for that collaboration to occur such that we're helping to manage risk and not increase them? What are the right practices for the disclosure of vulnerabilities between vendors and between vendors in the research community and governments? And then also the collaboration that occurs both with computer emergency response team and the law enforcement parts of governments. There's a lot that's occurring in this space. And all of that feeds into how industry works to influence the public policy environment. And we're doing a lot in this space. Whether it's shaping domestic or national cybercrime policies, things like sentencing guidelines, helping governments understand impacts of dual-use export control models, that has been a very popular topic of late, to explaining some of the impacts to industry of the law enforcement challenges and the inefficiencies in the mutual legal assistance and MLAT processes. There's a lot that needs to be done in the policy environment. That's just a little bit of context to hopefully tee up a discussion among the group. I did have a pre-call with most of our panelists, and I have no concerns that it will be a lively discussion. For those of you who are here as the audience in the room, the overall structure of our panel is we're going to be doing about 50 minutes or so of structured Q&A. It's going to cover 3 broad areas, and I'll introduce each as we move through them. But the first is, what are efforts today to secure the system, or excuse me, what are the efforts underway to secure systems today? What's happening in the current environment? The second section is going to focus on collaboration. And as I noted earlier, we're going to get to industry collaboration, industry to government collaboration, and government to government collaboration and how it affects industry. The third section of our overall panel is going to be securing the future, looking over the horizon into what are the technology trends that are coming, and also how that affects the policy landscape. One of the things that I've challenged the group to do is to make sure we're not just focusing on the problem. There's a lot of things where we can all sit around and admire the challenges of cyberspace today, but really to think about the opportunities, technical, operational, and policy opportunities and solutions. And then also, I very much so encourage the panel to have cross-panel discussion. If you agree or disagree or want to add to the response of one of the other panelists, I think that is oftentimes one of the more interactive and interesting sessions. So with that, and I actually did that perfectly on time, we're going to move into the panel. So the first section, as I discussed, is going to be on securing systems, securing the systems of today. So I'd like to start kind of with everyone speaking to this first question, and it's about setting the context. There is so much more going on with investments in security and efforts to protect infrastructure, data, and users, but we also see the increasing number, scale, and complexity of cyber crimes. Is there an inflection point that's going to be coming? Is this going to flatten or decline at any point in time? Or do we really see this trend continuing to occur? Open it up to the group.
All right. Well, since I was the one who missed the pre-call, I'll go ahead and start first. One of the things that I thought was interesting, what you were saying is boards are increasingly being given the notion of what are my responsibilities here. And one of the things about security in general that makes it very hard to solve is that risk belongs to the business side, right? When we talk about risk, it belongs to the business side, but yet the technological details of this risk are so deeply embedded in the technology, it is very hard for the business owners to get that information and then to apply it in a way that makes sense for the business. So in other words, it's trying to fly a plane with no altimeter, right? You don't know how much risk you're accruing and so forth. So one of the things that I think that organizations definitely need to do is have a better system in which that risk can be tracked, measured, quantified, evaluated, and then passed over to the business side. So that can be one of the various indicators that the business side can then use to judge where spending needs to go in the business. The other thing I just want to quickly throw out is when we talk about the state of the situation right now, like where are things at the moment? So I have kind of the unique perspective, even though I've just started it, obviously at Sony. Before that, I was a consultant for many, many years, and I've worked with hundreds of different companies and their security teams. Most organizations don't even know what they're trying to protect. They don't know what networks they have. They don't know what their endpoints are. They don't know what their applications are. They don't know what their operating systems are. They don't know what constitutes a single web application. So when you have things like Heartbleed coming out, you've got companies all over the planet freaking out, saying, we don't know where we have this particular library, and trying to then figure things out post-incident, right, or post vulnerability being released. So I think one huge thing, I mean, it sounds very simple, it's nothing astronomical, but just by cataloging what we've got, data, technology, service, et cetera, would go a long way in helping the security side figure out what they are trying to protect.
Just to add on that, I think if we just walk a bit on the history of the infrastructure, we're realizing that the web was invented 25 years ago, and it was invented in Geneva, sits on the top of the internet, and it was not designed for security. So everything that's happening today is the consequence, basically, of infrastructure, which was not designed for that purposes. The entire cybersecurity problem now is still the fortress approach. Means people outside, they are bad people, people inside, we are good people, let's defend ourselves against the attacker. But the problem is not there. Sony, many other organizations have suffered for insiders penetrations, which are more complex to identify, number one, and to solve, number two. For instance, one of the discussions this morning was identity layer. There's absolutely no identity layer on the internet. So you remember this, a dog can go into the internet without being detected as a dog. So we are still on that paradigm on where people are not using a strong authentication to access into binding transactions. If you extrapolate that problem now with connecting 50 billion devices, which still are not yet, there's absolutely no standardization whatsoever on identification of IoT devices. We are loading the infrastructure with a complexity that the infrastructure has not been designed for. There is a statistics that says that you will need something like $130 trillion to secure the current internet, to be in a situation where we can conduct solid cyber security transactions. So we are in an infrastructural problem. It's not yet how board reacts or how CEOs react. We are basically on unsecure roads where we are loading a lot of traffic on those roads. So a very serious thinking needs to be done in securing the infrastructure itself. And maybe hardening the internet with something else, maybe industry-led internets that will be federating among themselves, but the current infrastructure is totally insecure.
Yeah, to build on that, I think the internet has been built being a collaborative model and a trust model. So the internet is at the same time your market, the battlefield. Part of the internet are based on your asset. Part of the internet are based on your competition or competitive asset. And nobody really mastered the master plan. So more than often, people, and to your point, lack the awareness or the understanding about what do I need to protect. I think times are over that you can just limit to the security perimeter of your company. I was giving a talk in CyberCon. Maybe the military side of the equation are looking at now situational awareness or red teaming the internet, trying to understand really how that battlefield is moving and what do I need to protect. So you cannot stop and limit yourself at the perimeter or at the border of your industry or company or country, but you need really to include everything moving forward.
So thank you. It sounds like we are not at an inflection point other than continuing to escalate. So next question really has to do a little bit with what companies' responsibilities should be in this space. As I said earlier, companies have infrastructure, data, customers, and users. What should companies be doing to help protect their IP, protect their companies' and employees' PII from the cyber criminals who are working to infiltrate their networks today?
So, on the company, I think the good opportunity, and maybe the Industry 4 in Germany and the World Economic Forum movements to the fourth industrial revolution is the way to go. There's a projection that says that if a company does not become a software company in the next 10 years, it will disappear. So that means that companies are becoming platforms. And before you become a platform, Microsoft is an example, Nokia is other, but there are many examples of companies, and they are now really thinking as a platform and not anymore as a group of sites interrelated between themselves. When you start to think as a platform, the first question then you start to think yourself is how people will access my platform. Therefore, the PII process of authenticating people into the platform becomes essential. How can my objects in that platform be authenticated as well? Because I have a responsibility of connecting those objects. And then all the data, the big data that those platforms generates becomes then the product of the company. So the platform concept is a powerful element. I think the future of the internet is going to be a future of multiple platforms that will be interconnect themselves in the same way we connect airports. I mean, a lot of people talk about cybersecurity, but what about airplane cybersecurity? Every day around the world, you have hundreds of thousands of planes that take off and land. And there is international organizations, and they handle that traffic process. There's IATA, which is an international organization that has handled the security at the airport level. So there's excellent models that are applicable that can be applied to the internet, provided that the companies becomes platform. I think that is essential. But the good news is a good business opportunity for them to do so, because if they don't, they will disappear. So I think it's a moral and economic responsibility to do so.
So as far as actionable things that these companies should want to do, I mean, obviously I already mentioned the fact that most companies just don't even know what they're trying to protect, right? So data classification programs and some way of classifying data, some way of tracking data, some way of identifying data that is already out there. Very few organizations, I think, have a very good handle on where their data is and how it's being protected. The same would be applied to all of their applications. So, I mean, obviously, a lot of the time, security folks often refer to the network, right? But remember, the network is just one part of this overall equation. You've got applications that sit on the network. Very few organizations have any idea what applications are actually out there. And these applications age, right? So you have new CVEs that come out that affect some library that built, that is in your application that's in a production environment. And very few organizations have any idea that one of the libraries that they're using have now gone out of date. So being able to track, having some kind of a system to track libraries, track components, and then obviously the same, you know, without even, you don't even have to say it, applies to networks and to endpoints and to everything else. Those are all things that if a company is not doing, we can't even go to the next level as far as what else should they be doing? Well, you need to at least have that kind of fundamental understanding of what it is that you're protecting. The other thing I would say is the fact that when you're talking about customer data, right? When you're talking about customer data, keeping something that I would always like to see is organizations letting customers know exactly how their data is being safeguarded, right? So we can teach the customer a lot by reaching out to them, letting them know what safeguards that we are actually taking. So whether it be strong authentication, whether it be all the different things. I've asked numerous companies before in the past, like, okay, you want my sensitive data, how are you going to protect it? And they just say, oh, well, you'll have to just trust us, right? And this is like even security organizations. I had this kind of beef. I won't go into it. But yeah, nevertheless, it's something that we need to do, I think, responsibly as well, just like there's ingredients lists on food and just like how other areas, they let you know how this thing was built or what's going on in the back end. I think we need to do that for customers to show them respect.
Yeah, maybe to build on that, I think definitely people need to move from the spreadsheet that listed all the website from the company to new tools, automatic tools to really understand the exposure and what kind of asset do I need to protect. You mentioned Earthbleed at the beginning. I think this one was eye-opening for some company because you have in one day to resecure most of your website and assets, and we've monitored that. And I think out of the 1.8 million website that we were monitoring, only 10 to 15% went fixed in the first 2 weeks. And we checked 10 months later, and there was something like 20% still unpatched. So the issue is that you don't know what you need to protect, and if you know, you don't have the means to really react in real time almost.
But in terms, just to add on the data protection, I think the first thing we have to take away of the data protection is the concept of data. I mean, in our days with our technology now, you don't have to have data per se. A data means a record stored somewhere. And the moment you store that record somewhere, a hacker will be able to hack that data. There's absolutely no way to stop that. What the hacker will not be able to do is to access a bunch of clusters of data, and they are totally distributed among the organization in a way that cannot be compiled through an attack. For instance, in Switzerland, my company has helped the Geneva government to do e-voting online. We have been doing that for nearly 15 years now. This is not yesterday. So the only reason hackers cannot hack the system is because the data is decapsulated and molecularized in so many different ways that you eventually can get a piece of the data, but never the entire data. PII is actually the head of data. If you encrypt the PII and you leave the attributes of the client in different databases, the client will be totally protected because it will be impossible for a hacker to compile the PII and all the attributes at the same time. The attacks on banks, people stealing data, is because data is stored on databases. And you can even imagine how, in some cases, that database is even all databases, which are very easy to hack. So molecularizing the concept of data and creating the definition between PII versus attributes, it's an excellent technology that can be applied immediately.
Interesting. So wait, so just to make sure I understand, you're saying that organizations should not store data in any one given place, but it should be spread out. But all you're really doing is you're effectively raising the bar for the attackers to be able to reassemble all these things, right?
And increasing the complexity as well.
Right,
Because
yeah.
you will never be able to get everything in one place.
Yeah.
Including people inside the organization.
Yeah, yeah.
What happened actually is people inside the organization, were, Snowden and all these guys, they have total access to all the data. So once you have access to all the data, you have the possibilities to take it away. In the case of the PII, you can walk away with a list of people with $100 million in their accounts. You will know that attribute $100 million account, but you will never be able to track back to the person because the PII will be encapsulated and encrypted in a different place.
I thought it was interesting what you said. That's why hackers can't hack the system in Switzerland for voting. So hopefully we haven't issued a challenge, right?
Yeah.
But if the Swedish pirate party takes over Switzerland in the near future, we'll know what happened.
But it's going to be a fight.
Yeah. But getting back to your point, one thing about Heartbleed was it took the world by storm because it affected so many organizations at one time. However, this happens on a daily basis. Every single day, new CVEs are released, and they might not affect 50% of the web, but it might affect 5%. It doesn't make the news, and organizations have no idea that this is even going on, or they should even be keeping track of the components that make up their critical systems.
Yeah. To your point, I think we have global customers that have something like 750,000 IP internet-facing addresses, where you have assets behind that, servers behind that, running software. So it's not a matter of just once per year that you need to fix those, but it's, I think, a daily check that you need to do, and then a daily update of the software. And it's becoming a real challenge.
Yeah.
And we are even not talking about the Internet of Things that will be later on the discussion, but because we are still in millions, not in billions.
Just to follow up on that point, because I really like what you just said. Yeah, I mean, security was often, I come from the world, for example, of application security and so forth, and it used to be with application security, you had my yearly scan of an application, right? You obviously can't you need to have continuous scanning on all aspects of security. these types of gates that we're used to, kind of assembly line style gates, like, okay, you build the product, you test the product, you then do security on the product. That's way too late in the game, but we'll probably talk more about that when we get to the future.
I'm actually going to jump in and go to our next question. Not because I actually encouraged you guys to have cross-panel discussion, but I want to make sure we get through all of our topics as well. So I do want to hit, it is very obvious, hopefully to everyone in the room, that we have some great expertise in this panel. But that expertise does not necessarily live everywhere, and we certainly have a scale issue in the workforce. And so how do you think that we need to work to actually improve and provide sufficient expertise to both understand and act to prevent and respond to cybercrime?
Just maybe to start with, I think what you are doing here in this conference, I was actually very impressed by seeing that there was an educational roundtable this morning, even before people started to work. And I got this book in my deck, which is Cybersecurity for Dummies. So we should start that way. I mean, as you say before, cybersecurity is a very big thing. It can go from enterprise security, personal security, infrastructure security, and it's impossible for one person to, even an expert, to know everything about everything. So the people working in governments versus working in enterprises versus working in a social media company, they have a totally different perception and responsibility versus cybersecurity. And I think somebody needs to segmentate that. I mean, one of the things we do at the council level of the World Economic Forum is to segmentate industry by industry what cybersecurity means for each of them. And there's a lot of very good documentation that has emerged out of that segmentation. I think that's the starting point, to really define. It's like you do in the medical sector. I mean, you go to see a doctor, and a doctor will say, okay, you know, you don't look good, but by the way, go to see this specialist or this one, then they will have a better opinion than me as a doctor to tell you what is actually happened to you. We need that process. We need to have a doctor that says you have a problem, and then we need to have a specialist that can help you really to resolve that problem.
Yeah, I think we all know that we are lacking a lot of talents when it comes to cybersecurity. Not only talking about the technology side of that, but I'm starting to see now university, MBA schools starting to talk about digital transformation and then including the cyber threat, cyber risk into the program, because it's nice to have a bunch of engineers understanding the issue, but if your C-level or if your government level don't get that, I think it's useless almost. So we need to be educated also on those topics, the same way we've been educated 10, 15 years ago. We were educating people on the web. What does it mean for e-commerce at that time, or e-business? Now it's business only. But we need also to include that in the risk. So we are now really facing a global risk, and cross education exchange between having lawyers and engineers talking together, I think is key, because it's not a silo type of answer that we will have moving forward.
Yeah, I would agree. And one thing that I'm a big fan of is actionable advice. So a lot of the times, and I go to many security conferences every single year, and I hear a lot of like kind of platitude type talking, like we need to build systems that are more flexible and robust and this and that. But where are one thing that we have to do better, I think, as security professionals is, whenever possible, give actionable advice out to folks. And I know that's not always easy. Like, my response almost always to a security question is, it depends, right? You need to have the context in order to really determine what the advice would be. But where possible, try to be more actionable. And to that regard, I'm a big fan of maturity models. So, for example, since I've been talking about application security, OWASP has, the OWASP organization put out a maturity model for building secure web applications called OpenSAM. And what I like about maturity models is you can self-assess where you are, and then you can get very concrete pieces of advice and steps, security activities that should be implemented to then reach that next level. Now, you have to make sure that the maturity model reflects reality. So, I mean, anybody can write a maturity model. A consultant is always going to have one that increases consulting, right? Or whatever it happens to be. So what I would like to see are more organizations come together and really, based on industry best practices, put together maturity models. So when we talk about verticalization and individual verticals, and information sharing, which I think is going to be the next question. So let me just briefly say that if you can stand to form some kind of alliance with competitors and then share information just to the point of trying to get best practices to be documented, now a maturity model all of a sudden has some tangible benefit, whereas just kind of like
Oh, we gotta keep going.
yeah, digging around the web and finding various things, as far as expertise involved is, it's better to have a maturity model. And I'll just say one last thing. The hunger out there for security is enormous, right? It is enormous. I think 5 years ago, I was living in Hong Kong, and I would put together a couple videos just using PowerPoint and stuff, and I threw them on YouTube. And I kind of forgot about it. And they've gotten now hundreds of thousands of views. I go to various banks, and they're like, oh, we know you. You made those videos on YouTube, right? So it's like the hunger, even just for like the most small amount of security information, is extremely large. So I think the education track and everything else is vital. We need to do more reach out to folks.
So I'm going to maybe add one comment to that and I think that we're going to have to think not only about the human capital investment, but also how to leverage technology innovations to scale security across the world. Things like cloud computing can help maximize the impact of the security professionals that we have. One other question here in this securing the current systems, I want to talk just very briefly about the policy landscape. Governments are very active on what to do to counter cybercrime and the efforts to improve the security of critical infrastructure, whether that's from cyber criminals or from other types of attacks. How do we see the trends unfolding? What are some of the effective approaches? And in particular, I think useful for this track, is how do differing legal and regulatory paradigms challenge industry responses and enable cyber criminals?
Just on the policy side, I worked in the UN for many years on policy, and it was difficult at that time, and it's even more difficult now. I guess we have one problem that sometimes is not well reflected in cybersecurity gathering is the understanding on the deep web, the dark web, some people call it. I mean, this is a very well-organized economy that has been there for a long time. And there's all kind of interpretation around that. Some people think it's great to have an anonymous environment because you will be able to help governments and they are in totalitarian regimes and use that anonymous channel to channel information. And that is fine, that area. But the dark web has also been used for everything that we are facing now in cybersecurity. So when you walk inside the dark web, and you understand the complexity there, and the fact that it's by far superior than the web, you start to thinking, will make any sense to do any kind of policy regulation at the web level while this environment exists? Well, it's more or less like putting traffic lights in a place where 10 times more cars will drive without driving licenses, right? So the dark web is maybe you know more about that part from your previous experience, but it's a subject has not been properly identified as maybe the regulation will start at that level to understanding the complexity of that environment, which is totally anarchical environment, and see how many of that complexity is reflected then in the open web, the commercial web that everybody uses.
One of the things about policy is, generally speaking, if we're talking about going after people, you need some kind of way of clearly assigning attribution to a crime, right? And policy obviously covers a wide range of things, but if we're just talking about that, I think there's probably well-received, well-acknowledged consensus that it is not easy, it is almost impossible to assign attribution to a group for a particular attack. So one of the things that I'm afraid about policies are, if you have policies that say, okay, let's say this government actor does X, then we respond with Y, you may be incentivizing groups, instead of attacking a certain country, to make an attack go through the country and then have other countries respond in kind. So I don't really I see policy as a little bit heavy-handed a lot of the times. One of the things that policy could potentially do is help organizations justify more security spend and budgets if they are held to some type of accountability, like accounting is, or like legal restriction, legal type requirements for business. If there's security requirements, that would be one thing. But the flip side to that is governments are obviously, policy is slow in acting, and we've seen policies in the past that, for example, there was I can't remember exactly what the policy was, but early days of the web, cookies had a bad name. So cookies were banned, right, from U.S. government websites. So they started putting session identifiers up in the URL, which were allowing the session identifiers to leak out to third parties. So in other words, the policy, because it's slow moving, may not be able to keep up with the security implementations and procedures that need to be accompanying any kind of a business on the web.
Yeah, to your point, I think it's a very complex question. You cannot decorate on one side the policy, the internet governance, global internet governance, and also acknowledge that maybe some company in our country don't want to lose their first mover advantage moving forward. So it's a complex one. I think if you look at the policy side, the Budapest Convention started about almost 12 years ago. I've just been adopted by 26 or 27 countries, including the US and Europe, but we are missing all the BRICS countries there. So we are lacking a global framework. I'm pessimistic on that aspect if we can reach once a global framework moving forward, but we need to keep pushing, but it will not be the sole solution.
And again, there are different issues on different policies. It's different policy to secure the internet and different policy to govern the internet. I mean, there are different subjects, different ways of treating those subjects. What we are talking about is cybersecurity.
Cybercrime.
Or cybercrime, which, yeah, cybercrime. You can then extrapolate to the platform concept. I mean, will you do cybercrime inside a closed environment like Facebook or like Apple, or like, once you control the infrastructure, you can control as well the policy process. If you don't control the infrastructure, which is the case on the net, it's impossible to establish policies because the net was designed that way, in a way that nobody should impose any policy. So that's what I said before. Maybe IoT revolution allows us to bring the platform concept in a way then will be a network of platforms versus a network of networks.
So I'll maybe add just one other thing from the point of view of Microsoft as a global provider. One of the things we found really challenging in having these different legal and regulatory regimes is collaborating with governments across boundaries. Most companies, and including the ones who are represented up here, want to help improve national security and public safety and to detect and ultimately deter cyber criminals. Yet at the same time, when there are inconsistencies in laws, it does create challenges, particularly with regards to law enforcement access to data. So that's a space, I think, for collaboration. And so with that, we'll move into the next topic area. So again, I'd like to maybe start with a little bit of a context setting question. I'd like you all to characterize your view of the state of collaboration, remembering the three lenses. How is industry to industry collaboration going, government to industry, and industry to government, and between governments, particularly in the context of countering cyber criminals?
One of the things I was going to mention with the last round, and it would actually apply here. I never thought I'd say these words, but PCI might be an example we can learn from, right? In a positive way. And the fact that it's an industry-defined standard that is self-regulated and self-imposed, and it doesn't have the heavy hand of a government, and it is international by nature because it's not associated with any particular government. I'd like to see more similar constructs to that, where software vendors, they all say, look, this is a huge problem. We're going to have a minimum baseline of what we consider to be safe software. And the same could be applied to networks, and the same could be applied to et cetera. But I think self-governing and self-opt-in using shame as the way to motivate organizations to adopt these things, I think that would be positive.
Absolutely. And at the level of the government, I will say that cybercrime before being cyber is crime, right? And we have already international processes to fight crime. The crime is the same people, then they are transferring their exercise to the internet, because the internet, you can make a lot of money. Basically, it's a business, right? People don't cyber attack or do cyber crime operations if there will be no money involved. So it's a money factor. So we always, and there has been debated around that. What about involving organizations like Interpol and others in a more proactive way to bring the techniques of crime, fighting crime international, into cybercrime? Well, when I was at the World Economic Forum, the Council on Illicit Trade, and we studied the interconnectedness between illicit trade, which is $1 trillion economy, to cybercrime, and we realized actually that the money from cybercrime was coming from illicit trade. So every time anyone buys a fake watch, they are basically feeding the bank account of a cybercrime operation. So once people understand that, and the best education should be from law enforcement agencies, we then take a moral approach to it, a more social responsibility towards that specific problem.
I think, yeah, to your point, the digital transformation apply also to crime and therefore cybercrime now. And we need to also follow the same rules for the law enforcement side to make sure that they adapt and move forward in terms of new tools and means for collaborating, for exchanging data. But more broadly, I think we need to keep all the informal communication and information exchange that we have at the industry level. I think all the security officer and risk officer share within an industry such as FS-ISAC and the like. I think that's valuable. On the more technology side, I think all the third, first threat intelligence exchange, I think, is key. And a lot of companies such as Microsoft, Google are doing a lot there to make sure that we almost in real time share the threat pattern and make sure that we can adapt and try to cope with the pace of the attack, as we were mentioning before.
You know, one thing to kind of add to that point is many organizations believe security is like a trade secret, right? So they've invested quite a bit of money to try to figure out best practices, and for them, it is a differentiator. So just pick an example out of the blue. Let's say you're a bank and you have some security system and it differentiates you from your competitors. So a lot of organizations are hesitant to even mention who their security vendors are, much less the security best practices. But you know, FS-ISAC is a good example of an organization that's external to companies that adds more value than it presumably detracts from a company, and therefore people participate and organizations participate.
For those who might not be familiar, I think probably most people are, but the FS-ISAC stands for the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which is a model initiated in the United States but does have global representation, enabling financial services to share technical information generally on threats.
Yeah, and just a point on the industry side. I think, and again, not because you are Microsoft, but I congratulate Microsoft on the way they analyze cloud, for instance. It's one of the only companies that they localize cloud. So this way to analyze requires people accessing clouds. And some governments do not want to have centralized clouds sitting somewhere around the world. They prefer those clouds to be at national level and then create interoperability between law enforcement, government, anyone that needs to look at that data. They will have the credentials to access locally to that data. The bad news was that not many industry leaders were applying this delocalization cloud process, which is something that Microsoft does in comparison to Amazon and others. So I think this is part of the solution, is to localize data, localize identity, distribute the access so everybody can participate in it, and then create interoperability bridges between those data in a meta directory environment.
Nicholas, Christoph, and then we're going to go to the next question.
Yeah, I think to your point, that's a good trend, and we all hope that the industry will move forward into that direction before I think the law enforcement and the regulatory aspect will come and enforce things moving forward there.
Again, as I mentioned in my opening statement, there's a lot of collaboration and sharing of information that has occurred among industry and between industry and government to take down botnets. The SIMDA example that we talked about earlier. Is that a new norm? Is that something that can be scaled? What else can we do as industry and government to counter cyber criminals?
So yes, in connecting what I just said before on the localization of data, I think the trend is there because we are in an infection side. This is like a virus, right? When you get infected and everybody starts to get infected and have the same symptoms that you have, you start to be serious about it and say, okay, I by the way, going to share with you the way I was able to fight that virus. So we are in that situation now. Countries are, all of them getting infected, and the level of infection is getting to an epidemic. So I think the trend is going to be there, but we technology companies, we have to make that work easier. Is it still too complicated? I mean, if a country wants to share data with another country, how you do it? What channels you're going to use? Email? I mean, so you need to have, and this is the role of the industry, to develop interoperability bridges on data that allow people to exchange the data in a more efficient, secure way as well. Because if you don't secure the exchange of data, hackers can manipulate the data. Actually, one of the major threats now in cybersecurity is not even stealing your data, is to change the data that you have transmitted, and that could be even IP data. So that is a responsibility which is available to the industry to solve.
I think we have to definitely follow that model and moving forward. Just take an example on our side. We have a software running in 150 million TV set and set-top box. Most of them are now being connected to the internet. And botnet will not stop at the server or PC or smartphone level. They will go everywhere. We've already seen attacks just to turn TV set into a Bitcoin mining machine or cyber soldier. So facing the explosion of connected devices, I think we need really definitely to adapt the way we fight back. And I think the botnet fight is a good model that we can maybe learn from.
Do you have anything to add?
Well, I'm always a little bit cautious when we talk about involving governments in very rapidly changing situations, because the next thing you know, it's the 800-pound gorilla and it's inspecting everything. So I'm much more of a fan of voluntary collaboration of organizations. And how about, I mean, obviously we have economies of scale. Obviously governments have much more money, but the converse is voluntary organizations can be more nimble and really trying to find solutions for the verticals that they represent.
So maybe one other question in the collaboration space, and then we'll move to looking over the horizon. And this may end up going technical or not, I'm not sure. But how does industry help enable investigation and prosecution of cyber criminals? And how can industry do that? And are there policy changes that are needed to help enable that collaboration between industry and government against cyber criminals?
Maybe to your point, we need to make sure that we have the appropriate legal framework to share those information proactively. So because today is the burden of the law is more on the good side and not on the bad guys. So if we want to collaborate between two companies, we need to take into account the 200 plus legal framework around the world, and that's an issue. And I was mentioning in the introduction also, fighting botnet is good, but it's even better if we can proactively map the weaknesses of the system and share that weaknesses. And today, even having the mapping of that weakness is a very sensitive part of the game, because you know how to attack your frenemy. And we need to protect that. So I was mentioning that situational awareness map. So if we can, because both the bad guys and good guys can, map the internet and map all the weaknesses of the internet. So sharing at that level proactively would be even more better than fighting back the crime when it occurs.
The problem of cyber attackers is they don't leave any trace. I was talking to Robert McFarlane. He designed the Star Trek, satellite system to detect if a nuclear missile was sent from one country to another and shut down that missile. And he told me the problem you have in the internet is when somebody sends a missile, we don't know from where it comes from, right? So it's absolutely no way to shut it down. So that's the problem we're facing on the internet. So obviously the analytics on this type of attacks needs to be analyzed in a total different way. And companies should be sharing that information. I mean, the problem that they don't, the companies don't want to share information in cybersecurity. I started just recently, but this is not always the case. To the point that some people are saying, what about if we put a cybersecurity auditing company? We bring auditors, look in the same way we do financial audits on our performances. What about if we do a cybersecurity audit? And by a third trusted party comes from outside. So they will investigate if that company is doing everything required, first to solve the problems they have, but also to share information with other industry players. Something needs to happen. We are not doing it yet.
Dad, or you want next?
I'm good.
Okay. I might just add, I think that there are opportunities, particularly as the technology we started to talk earlier becomes more platform rich and application rich, to help with enabling forensics tools to help investigators understand and start to act at scale, and then also some capacity building, being able to understand the infrastructure in order to do that work and help build legal, prosecutors and judges who understand the law enforcement aspects of this is another space. We're going to go ahead and move over into securing the future. We've already started to hear peeps of this, talking about IoT, talking about smart televisions and set-top boxes. My favorite one is the refrigerator who's going to DDoS the world. But what I'd like to ask the group is, how are emerging and future innovations, whether it's the ones we've talked about, big data, big trust, automation, cryptocurrency, wearables, how are they changing the cyber risk landscape, both in terms of introducing new challenges, but also helping create innovations that address challenges, both sides?
Well, I'll start. Everybody in this room, right? You're either in security or you're a stakeholder. I want you to think, when do you involve security in your product, right? So if you're building it, if you have some kind of a device and whatever, I think security is often an afterthought, which is interesting because accounting's not an afterthought, legal's not an afterthought. Well, I don't know, maybe it is, but most of the time, first, before you do anything, call your lawyer, right? Before you make any kind of decisions. It should be something similar with security. In other words, security, hopefully, will ultimately be seen not as like a burden that you have to do, but it is a part. It is, the security partners are going to be people that are going to be helping you develop a product or an application or whatever it happens to be from day one, so that security and privacy issues can go right into the very concept of the product and then go throughout the entire life cycle of the application. It's not earth-shattering what we have to do, because that's not happening today, I can tell you, in 99% of the cases.
Just, so I think we have an amazing opportunity to solve a lot of our problems thanks to IoT. IoT is going to put a lot of pressure in cybersecurity, because if we don't solve the cybersecurity problem, we will not have IoT. IoT will not happen. So that means that we are saying no to a $7 trillion economy emerging in front of us. The good news is that IoT has one element that the internet didn't have, is that we don't mind anymore to put an identity at the object level. We have a huge discussions about putting identity on people, anonymous. This is a big, big discussion on the internet. In IoT, an object has to have its own identity, otherwise your fridge will not be your fridge, will be somebody else, something else. So the identity layer will be created because IoT requires that identity layer. Now, the good news is, once you apply the identity layer, you don't need to have a platform anymore as a collecting data. I mean, the new trend, by the way, shooting a moonshot on IoT, is that the product itself has its own cybersecurity to detect the attacker. So it's the same thing, your cells in your body. If you got infected, your cells has the right intelligence to fight and communicate the other cells how you are fighting that infection. The same thing will apply to IoT. The intelligence will be at the object level. The object being attacked answers the problem, eventually solves the attack, and communicate the other objects. Look, this is the way I did it. Or no, by the way, I got really attacked. I warn you to shut down this process, because that you will be otherwise attacked. And this is not done through the internet. This is where I think, and our company is working on that, we are connecting now watches in Switzerland, intelligent watches to the internet, and we are now applying blockchain technology. Because the difference between blockchain is that you don't need to centralize data in a platform.
You might want to briefly let them know what blockchain is.
So blockchain is the underlying infrastructure of Bitcoin. I mean, everybody talks about Bitcoin, but actually Bitcoin has blockchain as an architecture. And contrary to the internet, the only thing blockchain does is a log. So every simple transaction has to be registered in the log. And if the log does not record the transaction, it means that the transaction didn't happen. So you don't need to centralize. You don't need to own. It's totally peer-to-peer. And the beauty on that, for currency is obviously a different subject, because banks will want to regulate. But if you use the architecture blockchain for IoT, or for car distribution or Ubers of the future, you solve a major problem of the internet now, which is the centralization aspect.
Christoph?
Maybe one of the challenge for when we talk about Internet of Things is it's complex, blurry. You don't really understand what it means. And I like to take the example of maybe 20 years from now, there is no reason you will not be sitting in a plane next to a robot. And that robot will be de facto connected to the internet. And the way he authenticates or identify itself is maybe an IP address, is whatever, all the technology we use in the Internet of Things. And it seems that when you take that kind of comparison, you will say, oh, no, but I'm a government, so I need to issue a passport or an ID to the robot because I don't know where he's coming from, if he is doing bad things in the plane, whose fault is that? And some of the thinking that you apply with that kind of example, we don't apply de facto on the Internet of Things because we just see a machine connected somewhere. We don't know why that thing's connected to maybe the internet needs to be authenticated. Who is really issuing the identity of that things? And that has been maybe produced in Japan, but who knows? And what that thing is doing connected to the local intranet or internet.
Just to add to that, I would say that when we talk about the Internet of Things as like a future concept, I would say we've already been here for a long time. Everybody in this room most likely has a wireless router, however you pronounce it, at your house. It's probably covered in dust. It's probably under a cabinet someplace, and nobody is, I am sure, probably checked to see if there's security updates for that router. And as a result, you've got routers all over the world that are extremely vulnerable to application attacks, or they have vulnerabilities, and it's the same basic thing. You've got a hardware device that has a operating system that's got a web application. It's never updated. It's basically left to kind of rot, right? So that is one thing we've kind of not done so good up until this point as far as auto updating of these devices. You know, when you just mentioned devices kind of in a decentralized way, you know, communicating with each other, the first thing I thought is, I wonder if I could convince a device to like DOS the other device, right? Send bad information. So the big ideas, I think, are going to be hard to implement without the smaller ideas of even the basics as far as secure libraries, updating systems, patching systems, and so forth, which we've not done a good job of in the past.
And the same, if I may, the same routers today, nobody feel liable to fix that. So, and even a router, you may imagine that the CIO of the company, if it's not your home router, will take care of that. But the IP camera of that kind of gears, nobody will care. If the same routers is the robot next to you or piloting the plane, then for sure it needs to be updated. For sure it needs to be have a health check or secure check on a regular basis. And today we don't apply the same thinking to.
Well, and that goes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, which is asset management, knowing what you've actually have, right, in an organization. If you don't know that these routers have operating systems that need to be updated, right, then it's never going to fall into the process. As far as the home routers, people. I mean, companies put out, oh, we have this update for this. There was a vulnerability in this hardware device, but then it's up to the individual person to go and then download it, which is, if we follow that same model with IoT in the future, just hope that the end users update and patch their systems, we're not going to make it very far in security, I believe.
I'm going to have to challenge the panel here on this point, which is you guys are all speaking to things that should be done. And Jerry, you highlighted they're not being done now. So there were key lessons learned in the IT phase that were not learned in the operational or OT technology phase. And we're coming up on the IoT phase. How do we actually, this environment is going to be very egalitarian. Anyone is going to be able to do innovation in this environment. These are going to be people and companies who do not have security expertise, who do not have relationships with governments. And so what I'm going to challenge the panel to provide to this room is, how do we start to scale to these organizations that are going to be holding PII and are going to be dealing with cyber criminals' attacks on what they are innovating?
One big difference is that IoT, the reputation of the manufacturer is involved into the product. So if you are Samsung and you're producing chips, or a French company producing the new NFC chips, they currently will not even think to put that chip on the market if they don't solve the initial cybersecurity problems that eventually the chips might have. So they are embarking OS, they're putting, it's basically like airbags inside the car. We are now, you remember where cars didn't have airbag, people die, and cars say, well, who cares? I mean, I wait until we have X million dead before I start to invest in putting the airbag. We are in the same concept on cybersecurity. People are suddenly adding those cybersecurity elements at the device level. And that's a very big step, because once you have the cybersecurity at the device level, you have a paradigm shift. Everything changes. Because you don't need anything like a super organization there telling you what to do. You take that responsibility because your product has to sell in competition to somebody else that is going to put cybersecurity as a design. The problem we are facing here is that IoT, currently, they are just putting cool objects on the market. They are not yet thinking in terms of securing their product. Actually, in our experience in Switzerland, what the common denominator we found is counterfeiting. You know, we went to the watch industry, and we say, Rolex, you sell 1 million watches in Switzerland, but by the way, you have 20 million counterfeited Rolex. What about if you put technology at the watch level, and Kudelski and Weisky, we're both doing that, that will allow Rolex to prove that this object is actually authentic and not counterfeited. The next layer of that is to connect that watch directly to the internet, because that watch has already NFC technology that allows to be connected. And the next one is to put an OS into the object that allows the object to be intelligent, and so on and so on. That's the process that we have identified as a good process.
So I think you need to create means of creating incentive for the people paying a bit more for security. To your point, Secure by Design solution, I think it's not a technical issue. You can improve drastically, I think, the security, but only if you can justify the cost, because that has a cost. And incentive there might be a way forward, moving forward. And transparency, if you know that TV set is running Linux in there and that not been updated, and then you have an issue with that, people will start to be a bit more aware of what they are buying and and whose duty is that to fix the things there. Today, we don't know. It's difficult enough already with the smartphone and tablets, but I think the IoT will just explode the complexity, and for the normal human being, understanding that will be, I think, almost impossible moving forward.
I like how you use Linux as the example, not Microsoft as the operating system that needs to be updated.
I hesitated a bit.
Right. Yeah, you know, this is one of those questions that's very hard to solve, right? How do we get more proactive about security? How do we convince, to me, it's a little bit of a long shot, though, to think that we can convince consumers to use security as a selling point, because customers have even super technical people have very little means of distinguishing what is a real security feature that is positive and which one is just security theater, right? So I think what we're going to see, though, is the pressure of crime and criminals, which is what we're talking about now. That additional pressure, I think, is going to it's going to lead companies and organizations to develop standards. Right now, I mean, this is, I used to teach a lot of classes in coding securely. And I would teach at, top companies all over the world. Developers who are working on the most critical systems were always amazed. They said, well, we want to know the standard for coding secure web applications. There is no standard, right? There's no. What's that?
There is one now.
Which is?
ISO 27034, which talks about the security development lifecycle.
Okay, but what we're talking about, in the technical weeds, like, okay, I'm using, Spring, and Hibernate, and what are the best practices to code this securely? And there just simply aren't these. There are no best practices to follow. So a lot of people are kind of flying blind, and they have additional pressure from the business side to get things out faster. I mean, one of the things about IoT, it is egalitarian, just like the web was. And so you're going to have a huge rush to market, right? Because people have always thought, push it out and we'll fix it later, right? And that's unfortunately it's not a winning situation. So hopefully, as it could be that quality and craftsmanship of these products become a major selling point in customers' minds, but more likely it's going to be forced on organizations. And hopefully they deal with this, like I was saying, in some kind of a voluntary organizational basis so that they can share these best practices and get them out there and then make publications available. And one example of this is OWASP. It's not the most functional organization in the world, but it does do good in the fact that it does try to push out some type of standards for web and mobile development and so forth.
So I think we're going to have about 20 minutes left for Q&A. I have one last question I always like to give you guys. Go ahead and get ready, folks with the microphones. Go ahead and get ready with the mics to give folks for the questions. Last question to the group, and we started to bleed into this with the answers that were provided on how do you actually create scale in the innovation environment we're going to have, which is how will policy need to evolve to counter cyber criminals in the future? How can this environment be a little bit more agile? Is it going to be a combination of a regulatory environment for higher risk things and a volunteer environment for others? What do you think in terms of creating that agility in the public policy space?
So I'm going to be very brief on the. I think it's a multi-stakeholder approach. I don't think nobody has the maturity now to even dream to start to define policies. I think there's private sector has some views on it, the international organizations, the UN, the ICANN, everybody's trying to learn. And only an environment like this one where multi-stakeholders can openly debate and reach consensus is from my point of view, the only way out.
I would agree. Yeah, we're supposed to disagree, but right. Yeah, right. I agree. I mean, I think that we're at a phase in web, mobile, IoT, et cetera, where things are evolving and changing so rapidly that any kind of government interdiction on how to code or how to, define security, I think that would be problematic. I believe that this is going to be self-regulated, for the near-term future. I think organizations have everything to lose when it comes to cyber attacks, and therefore I see massive maturity. And I have kind of a unique perspective because I do work in my former organization. I worked with so many different companies, and I saw just in the last few years a massive maturity in organizations where before it was all compliance or like what is the minimum we can do just to check the box, but now all of a sudden it is much more security for the sake of security because boards are talking about this. You've got obviously board CEOs who are having to resign and so forth where based on cyber attacks. So I think we're going to see this without the heavy hand of government, in my opinion.
And I would have loved to have, I had a whole question around. I had probably at least twice as many questions queued up for the group, but they are very interactive, exactly as I asked them to be. I was going to go ahead and turn this over to the room. I see someone over here with the hand raised, and then over my shoulder, and then I'll look around after that. Please.
Thanks a lot. My name is Joseph Lorenzo Hall. I'm the Chief Technologist for the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm going to be a little provocative and ask Mr. Morera a question, but I'm not going to ask my own question. I'm going to ask a question from a friend of mine. So I hacked voting machines for my PhD, and Ron Rivest, the R in RSA, asked somebody this recently, and I want to see how you would answer it, which is if you've solved the internet security problem with internet voting, one of the most sensitive types of transactions you can imagine, because it potentially is a transaction over the internet that can change your entire physical government. Why haven't the defense departments, why haven't the health companies, why haven't the banks sort of beat your doors down to figure out how you did it?
So Switzerland is a very special country because before you get into e-voting, we have to learn how to do postal voting and decentralized voting, et cetera, et cetera. So the layer of electronic voting was just one layer more on many other layers the country has already created without even the need to have electronic voting. So, for instance, the data is decentralized at the county level. You don't vote in a centralized ballot. The data is sent through quantum connections between the county and the server. So it's a model. I mean, it has been there. I mean, we Swiss, we are a pretty democratic country, and if we are still democratic, it's because the voting is working. Otherwise, we might be in a trouble now. So it's a benchmark on giving cybersecurity some merit. I mean, we are always telling that cybersecurity is bad and we are compromised, but there are good practices around the world where cybersecurity works. Not everywhere. Actually, one of the problems we had, if we will not be able to take the Swiss example and bring to the United States because the voting process is totally different, and they are still voting with those very expensive machines. Then the lobbyists are not willing to sacrifice, right? So I guess cybersecurity is also geopolitical. An experience from one country doesn't necessarily apply to another country, but they are best practices. And this is that's my only point on the voting, is that they are best practices that can be extracted and applied to a superior system that could eventually solve all the problems.
I'm Fang Nguyen from Enoria and the University of Tokyo. My question is regarding the future. 3 months ago, the NSA officially announced the transition to post-quantum cryptography. So from the industry perspective, are quantum computers considered as a serious threat?
Well, cryptography is obviously going to be rendered ineffective at that point because cryptography is based on the fact that it takes a certain amount of time to calculate, particular equations, and with quantum computing, that is going to fall into disarray. So I would imagine, and I'm not an expert at this, but there will be quantum cryptography that will have to be developed in order to but I'm definitely not a cryptographer.
I think it's a lot of hype about quantum cryptography and the quantum supercomputer that is going to break all the ciphers. First of all, it's very complex, and I don't think anybody has anything like that in the next years to come. And by the way, the crypto are evolving a lot. Now you can hash keys in total different ways than you did a few years ago. With the arrival of IoT, by the way, it's going to be even more difficult because every single object will have its own encryption, so you won't be able to decrypt all the objects in one go. You will have to go one by one, which is not the case now. So I think quantum physics is more interesting, from my experience, in how to transport data from point to point than actually on the encryption level. I think encryption is going to evolve tremendously through IoT processes. That's my experience.
And I think it's always a trade-off between technology is not the only answer. So you need to trade off between protecting the privacy of your citizen, but also protecting your citizen, and lawful interception, those kind of dual use things, export limitation will have a play in that answer. So technology, yes, is evolving, but we need to also sometimes choose our battle.
Hi there, my name is Roel Schaumburg, Director of Research with Shadow Dragon out of New York. I think one of the things not discussed during this panel discussion is another way to incentivize some of the vulnerabilities to go away is by using bug bounty programs. For those not aware, that's where companies incentivize security researchers, generally with cash, I guess,
and prizes.
to get reports on important vulnerabilities. So I kind of, especially as during this panel discussion, we heard words like impossible and never, which as a technologist always get me a little anxious. I wanted to ask that for voting machines in particular, does the panel think it would be beneficial to the public and to everyone if bug bounties with like major cash prizes, let's say like $1 million, should be awarded, so that the security of these systems can be properly vetted by outsiders?
I think this is definitely something to look at. It will again rebalance what some government or bad guys are paying for 0 day today. So 0 day is a security weakness is not being discovered before. And if you pay on one side $500,000 to $1 million for 0 day, and on the other side you don't incentivize people to find those weaknesses, I think we will have it's a race to the bottom, to my point of view. So it's definitely something to take into account and maybe incentivize a bit more at company and or government level moving forward.
Well, I'm a little bit confused on the question because bug bounty programs do exist, right? So the market obviously has already validated that these are things that are beneficial, and I know there have been some very large bounties paid out. So are you talking about from governments, or are you talking about companies? Because companies are already doing this.
Well, there are a couple companies that do it, but still not too many. I guess Microsoft is now one as well. But yeah, I mean, my question in particular was referring to voting machines. So I guess then you're touching on government very much.
Right. Well, I mean, I can't speak to the Swiss voting machines. I never use the word absolutely and never, right? So, but if I was the Swiss government, would I do something like that? I mean, it's one of those situations where, let's say you made the schematics for the voting machines public so that everybody could do, many eyeballs and shallow bugs. Would the cash incentive of $1 million be sufficient to offset the financial gain a hacker would have by identifying a zero day? Now, you could say that's just a security through obscurity. I get it, but I'm saying I would imagine, and I'm not privy to the Swiss government, right? But I would imagine that would be what was going through the minds of the stakeholders.
Well, I remember that there were a bunch of researchers in the Netherlands who did research into voting machines there, and they were mostly students. Students will be very motivated for $1 million.
Good point.
Hello. Oh, we're back. So one of the things I think I would just add into this point is that I think what you're really exploring is what is the right incentive or disincentive for security researchers. And one of the questions I had in my notebook was around collaboration there. So I'm glad you raised the question. Something to highlight is I think that there are not just bounties for bugs, but organizations, mine included, and others are also incentivizing security researchers for mitigations, and in particular, mitigations that help reduce or mitigate against overall classes of vulnerabilities. So as governments and industry and the researcher community are thinking about what is the right combination of behavior among that multi-stakeholder community to help drive towards risk reduction as the goal. This is an interesting conversation that I'm seeing move from the technical community and into the policy space in many governments around the world. So thank you for asking the question. We have about 8 minutes left. I have more questions, but I wanted to see in the room, Danielle has a question right here.
Great, this is working? Okay, I'm Danielle Kriz. I'm a cybersecurity fellow with New America in Washington. And given that one of the themes of this panel is policy and legislative trends, and I think both Jeff and Carlos at some point a little earlier, you were saying how it's not helpful if governments try and mandate particular technologies or ways to code, and I completely agree with that, but I think that despite that sentiment, you do see a lot of governments around the world coming up with proposals that would do just that, whether it's telling you how to code your products, where to build your products, what to report, or how to manage your risks. So as representatives of industry, I'm curious, how do you see your role in helping to better educate governments about how they can be helpful as opposed to harmful?
Yeah, I think the role of government in cybersecurity should be the first line of defense. Governments, especially if you combine with intelligence services and people that can really help you. For instance, back again to Switzerland, but Switzerland is a small country. We are not protected by the European Union or by anybody like that. We have to do everything ourselves. And we have federal police. We can go and talk to them. And they talk to us. They give us good advice. In some cases, they help us to solve a critical problem. So I think the partnership has to be there. It's the only way it will work. Government cannot not be on the cybersecurity the education process because, in my opinion, has the first line of defense. Nobody in our days have enough money, even big corporations, to be autonomous in the process of securing themselves. You need participation by government.
You need that, and I think you need also to create incentive for government to invest into that. Typically, the World Economic Forum is publishing their competitiveness report. Why not a cyber maturity index for countries to benchmark themselves against their neighbor? I think it will help also to take that seriously and to move forward, because we need to have both the investment and then the legal framework moving forward.
I don't know if I would agree that government should be your first line of defense. I was thinking more like the last line of defense, right? You wouldn't. Okay, I was just saying, like, I wouldn't go to my developers and say, "Don't worry about it. Government's going to protect us. We're good," right? Right. I know. Yeah. So I mean, a lot of the contact I've had with governments and so forth has been more informal, right? So ultimately it would be good to have that more formalized, where instead of like your, a kind of the one-off FBI agent or government official asks questions kind of at random, I think it would be much more to have some kind of formal way, potentially, that companies, industry, organization can submit, especially very technical details maybe to government. But I mean, we all know the Rainbow series, right? So imagine that we gave that to developers and say, here, study this and learn this. I think that would be kind of counterproductive, especially at the rate at which we're talking about technical details in coding. Frameworks change all the time. They change every single day. So having like some kind of a government oversight that would tell you, okay, make sure that you store your encryption key this way, I don't think that would be helpful.
And then there's a question across the room. One of the things I think hopefully most people recognize in the room is that what these folks are talking about, this industry to government collaboration, is often characterized as the public-private partnership. And thinking about helping governments understand the potential consequences of action or inaction in this space is one of the things I think is a really key role for industry. And then also something that I've seen in a very practical sense, because I liked Jerry's let's focus on practicality, is this idea of exchange programs between industry and government. There is a lot to be learned from walking in someone else's shoes. Whether it is industry literally learning about the complexities of moving something through government, or the complexities of not having to deal with return on investment, but rather a national security or public safety responsibility, or a government official actually learning, hold on, this is about a bottom line and shareholder value in the return on investment, or the agility that the industry environment is in right now, I think is hugely insightful for both parties. I just wanted to jump in there. I think there's one other question across the room, and we have 3 minutes and 30 seconds, so it'll be a lightning round across our answers.
All right, so can you hear me here? Okay. This is for Carlos. Basically, a little background on myself. My name is Daniel Clemens. I run a company called Shadow Dragon. And there was a statement made where, there are no artifacts when there's an attack made on the internet during the forum. 15 years ago, like when the Chinese had launched Code Red, there was a lot of artifacts within that binary. I know because I analyzed it to give heads up through collaboration with the government to thwart the DDoS attacks against the White House. And so, like, when I hear you make that statement, it kind of rubs me the wrong way because, after doing 1,000 forensic cases and analysis, how can you make a statement that there are no artifacts when there are attacks?
The question is, how do you make a statement about the lack of artifacts when there are some out in the internet? So I think that's actually a really interesting question. I'll just say one thing. The conversation on attribution continues to evolve over time. Technical attribution continues to advance. Probably helpful for the room to understand there's also something around policy attribution or political attribution that's very different. But a question to the technical folks around the table around how do we think about that in today's infrastructure?
So my point is that the infrastructure is evolving. I mean, there's absolutely no way to stop. It's like a movie. You cannot stop in a picture because the infrastructure is evolving all the time. We are bringing IoT, we are bringing devices, we are bringing organizations into the cybersecurity arena, and it's very, very difficult to get a picture on the situation. So I can talk one-to-one later on that specific point, but my point is that the infrastructure is evolving. It's a moving target. It's very difficult to establish a relation with infrastructure.
Either folks, we have about 1 minute.
I would just say, of course, there's artifacts left from an attack, right? You've got log files, you've got binaries, you've got, they're endless. Not always enough, though, to figure out exactly who the perpetrator was, but there's always going to be artifacts, absolutely.
Agree. Yeah.
So I'd like you to join me in thanking the panelists, as well as you all in the room. Thank you for your active participation, and I hope you join us for the third panel in the cybercrime track, which will focus specifically on the information challenge and information sharing challenges and opportunities. Thank you all.